Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Greg Woodmeyer, and I'm here to present on challenges and considerations for project communications management and outsourcing models. This is for project management for information systems in the Department of Computer Science of Graduate Studies at Athabasca University. There are a few topics to go over today, but first I'd like to start off with what is outsourcing. So a common definition for outsourcing is the contracting of work, tasks, or processes to create a product or service. Outsourcing has been seen as a way for companies to focus on core capabilities, obtaining outside expertise, and to benefit from new and novel technologies. In the traditional sense, outsourcing is synonymous with offshoring and utilizes low-cost labor. Consider examples like the clothing industry. In software development, it is common practice to outsource part or all of the development project. Through the paper and this presentation, the company that's looking for outsourcing is going to be referred to as the organization, and the outsourcing company will be known as the vendor. In a paper by Jens Dibbern on sourcing of software services, the degree of outsourcing should be determined through what knowledge is actually required and the cost advantage to outsourcing this knowledge in something called differential trust. Challenges of project communications are varied and impactful to the project, and they include things like time zones and language barriers, project monitoring and stakeholder communication, and data and content communication and collaboration. There's much literature on many of the included topics here, fewer literature that discuss each of the topics in the first sections, and none that were identified that tie together project communication and data communication. This is where the primary motivation for this paper comes in, to present and consider project communication and data communication as one. In the past, the only information available to stakeholders was that which was presented during project meetings and through gathered documentation. The focus of the paper and this presentation are to review literature on these topics, describe the challenges that are inherent, and consider recommendations to mitigate challenges of communication between the organization and the vendor. First up, we're going to talk about long-distance relationships. These include things like distance barriers and language barriers. So for distance barriers, in outsourcing and software development, this implies contracting at the global level. Knowing this, it's simple to understand how separation can be in excess of 8 hours, with little or no overlap for voice or video conferencing. So what do organizations do to overcome distance barriers? Some things are augmented hours. So business hours are altered by the organization and or the vendor to create overlap. After hours contacts can be provided, like a support center for discussions, questions, and updates. And occasionally, workers are co-located from the vendor to the organization's site. Research by Ahmed Hamouda in exploring strategic software development outsourcing found through case studies that much of the issues with these barriers were solved through co-location, although at additional cost. And further to that, co-located outsourcing should be treated as an internal service instead of an outsourced solution or third-party consultant working within your office. The second part to this is language barriers, where different languages are spoken between the organization and the vendor. Sometimes this can cause misinterpretations of figures of speech or terms, and organizations and vendors need to work together to overcome these language barriers. Vendors will sometimes require staff to be fluent in languages of frequent organizations that they work with. Meeting minutes are created after every meeting, distributed, reviewed, and verified by both sides, sometimes requiring a sign-off. And vendors may send project staff to the organization's site for in-person meetings. This would typically be considered in advance of the project and budgeted for appropriately. Another part of communication is project monitoring. The primary challenge with project monitoring are a few simple questions. Where's the project at? What have we spent and how much budget is left? Or when will the project be complete? Monitoring tasks, deliverables, costs, and schedules are some of the basis of project management. In outsourcing, the vendor is entrusted to monitor and report on this accurately, while the organization needs to verify and report internally. So the problem is that the information is usually outdated, even if only by a week. It can still have financial reporting implications. So there are some past approaches to overcoming trust issues and some of these questions. Daily utilization reports. These are like timesheets, but they're more focused on completed tasks that day and what is in scope for the following day. Weekly recaps, which summarize the daily utilizations to show the relationships between tasks and contributions to the overall project. and invoicing, which usually has to be analyzed internally by the organization to verify invoice tasks with utilization and recaps. In research by Thomas Toth in client-vendor trust relationships, determined through a literature review that communication over the project was best performed through voice and video, and higher levels of trust were gained through more frequent meetings. Toth challenged the idea and the current approaches to shift concentration to how collaboration and reporting is performed, that tools only do so much, and that ongoing communication is required in between interactions. That interaction leads us into our stakeholders and stakeholder communication management. So stakeholder communications in outsourcing means transferring information about the project from the vendor to the internal stakeholders and vice versa. The primary challenge is keeping stakeholders updated on the project's progress. Stakeholder involvement is important to ensure strategic alignment with the organization. Stakeholders need to see value in projects and their performance and how outsourcing is benefiting the organization. This is difficult to achieve if they are uninformed, losing trust, or unable to have questions answered. One consideration when engaging stakeholders in the initial planning for software projects is leveraging a 24-hour factory type of approach, as discussed by M.R. Gupta in his 2007 paper. Gupta discusses utilizing multiple outsourced resources in equally displaced time zones for the benefit of a 24-hour factory. There is a caveat by Gupta that while communications and stakeholder involvement is improved, this is best suited to semi-structured work due to multiple handoffs during a 24-hour period. In software development, the challenge is delivering the right amount of the project as an iteration for demonstration, whether it's functional or not. The traditional way to keeping stakeholders updated on the project is through meetings, which, as discussed previously, has its own considerations. Some of these meetings could be recorded demonstrations. However, it's usually better to have these as live demonstrations to allow for questions and answers. Another way to involve stakeholders is to allow them to access development or test systems. This is less used, but still relevant, where the vendor provides access to a test system being developed for an organization to let them access, use, test, demonstrate internally to gather feedback and be able to provide that back to the vendor. Distance barriers and stakeholder communication are two parts of really what should be a three-part analysis, including data communication management. This is the main motivation for this paper, tying together project communication management and data communication management. As the outsourcing model changes and works through the challenges and approaches presented here, there is still a fundamental shift coming. Most stakeholders understand file storage as using their organization's local file server to store information. At some point, stakeholders have used local file storage for things like project meeting minutes, documentation, and deliverables. In software development, there are specialized places for storing the software code. These focus on and allow for versioning and collaboration. The challenge involved is surfacing this information from these repositories back to the stakeholders. In the traditional sense, stakeholders typically look at charts, timelines, schedules, and costs. Information in repositories isn't easily translated into this perspective. So approaches to this generally involve meetings with vendors to understand the work. Any information that is surfaced here is in another location for stakeholders to view from their primary data management, which really just ends up adding complexity for them. There are many options for these repositories. However, the next step is to look at something called data sovereignty. So this has a major impact on outsourcing, where organizations deal with project information that specifies the information is required to not leave the country. Many of the cloud storage offerings have local data centers. However, that's primarily for speed of access, and location of the information usually can't be verified to only live there, mostly for reasons of redundancy. In a paper by many authors at Microsoft discussing Windows Azure cloud storage, to achieve uptime and data availability, multiple data centers around the world are synchronized and load balanced. What this means is that content stored in Azure storage cannot be guaranteed to be in a set location, that it may change locations and be duplicated multiple times in various data centers throughout the world in just the same day. So the challenge is deciding where project data is stored in an outsourced project that allows the vendor to have efficient access and satisfying the project's data requirements. Because of these occasional requirements, some organizations are forced to host their own data and make it available from their data center. This does open up issues of security when providing external parties access to internal data by literally opening up a hole through their network. This leads us into a discussion on security, which is important in data communications management. Really, there's two opposing forces here, which is making data secure enough to not be compromised, but but still making the data available enough that stakeholders can easily access it in the current landscape, which really means from any device. There isn't a right or wrong answer here, as various organizations are successful at different implementations, as long as they're following best practices and providing training to their users. Promising research from Konrad Junman and others demonstrates a new thinking on security, where instead of focusing on who can access what information by roles within the company, for example, a stakeholder accessing tasks and schedules, and vendors accessing code and libraries, that the information itself can be told what it can be accessed for, using something in software called a mediator, which would analyze the person and the information and determine if access was actually granted. This is still experimental, but holds promise in linking these two opposing forces. So, communications in outsourcing. What are we doing today? Software development has many patterns and practices utilized based on the size and the type of the project. There's different methodologies. Waterfall and Agile are the two most common, used for software development projects, and often determine the type of communication required throughout the project. In outsourcing, the vendor will work with the organization to determine the methodology and how best to manage communication through the project. The challenges discussed throughout this paper and presentation aren't solved, however, they can be addressed and worked with. As a result, data communication management tools and stakeholder and project communication management tools have adopted many of the same best practices. Where I believe this is going, and where the most work in future research is going to be needed, is merging the best practices between project communication management and software development project communication management. What this really means is making project management tools available within places where, say, organizations are doing document co-authoring, using that platform to integrate with a software development project management tool where the vendor may be doing co-authoring on software code files. What this will allow is for recording and tracking of tasks in both places, updates to work, look ahead to the pipeline, and future schedule impacts. This information could be translated into a language understandable to both stakeholders within the organization and the vendor. Having a platform for both the organization and the vendor allows them to disregard the time zones by having real-time communication, and reduces the impact of the barriers discussed by lessening the need for communication at set intervals, such as the recap meetings, timesheet reviews, etc. There are a few platforms available that actually attempt to merge these topics, and the only one available that has an implementation is Microsoft Visual Studio Team Services with Microsoft's Office 365, which is still in its infantile stages of maturity and still requires a lot of effort to continue merging these two ideas. Papers used for this presentation and the literature review covered a lot of topics around outsourcing, mainly around the differences in different types of projects and styles of outsourcing between organizations and vendors. An interesting trend as I worked through many of these was to see how many of them asked similar questions and came up with different answers at the end for how to tackle various outsourcing problems. I believe this really highlights how different every project is in execution, especially when it comes to outsourcing, how companies and organizations use this technology, and how vendors respond through their project management internal practices. This also highlights the need for a standardized platform or tool to be able to merge these different types of communication to reduce the impacts on the organization and the vendor and simplify the process of accessing the information available to the project. This has been a presentation on challenges and considerations for project communications management in outsourcing models. My name is Greg Woodmeyer. Thanks for joining me.